Israel and Palestine have changed very substantially in the past week. If you look at the Israeli side, all the certainties, not only about their dealings with the Palestinians, but really about their whole military doctrine has been shattered beyond redemption. The Israeli military doctrine, as you may know, is that when Israel fights wars, they have to be quick, they have to be decisive, and they have to be fought on enemy territory. And what we're seeing now is a conflict that is neither quick, certainly not decisive, and most of all is being fought within Israeli territory. And most importantly, I think, is this, the idea that you have what was until a few years ago rightly considered a ragtag militia with rudimentary capabilities, able to carry out an attack of this size and scale and scope and sophistication, and at least briefly occupy an area of southern Israel that is larger than even the Gaza Strip from which it was launched. On the Palestinian side, the main change that we've seen so far is unfortunately physical, as viewers will have seen if they've been watching Al Jazeera or several other networks. Entire neighborhoods of the Gaza Strip simply no longer exist, and it seems that the Israeli military command is seeking to make up for its extraordinary, historic military failure and incompetence by just area bombing, carpet bombing, intensive bombing, of which I'm sure once the facts emerge will be that the main victims of this are not Hamas, are not its cadres and militants and leaders, but the ordinary civilians in the Gaza Strip who, let's not forget, live in the most densely populated speck of earth, speck of land on this planet, and have nowhere to go. This is not like other conflicts where when it breaks out in a certain country, people have the opportunity to flee hostilities to either a neighboring region or even a neighboring country. The Gaza Strip, as you know, has been sealed off from the outside world, has been blockaded for 17 years now.
And just on that point, as you say, we've seen just Gaza being pounded night after night, and we saw the army spokesman say quite openly that they're creating damage.
Yes.
Precision. Just tell us a little bit more about how these strikes have unfolded. Like, as you say, whole neighborhoods being destroyed, but simultaneously an attempt to cut off Gaza even further from the outside world, both in internet, phone signal, the passage even of food and aid. Just give us a little more of a sense of what's happening in Gaza right now.
Well, to give you an idea of the intensity of the current airstrikes in the Gaza Strip, they are being felt as far as Tel Aviv. People in the Gaza Strip, reporters in the Gaza Strip, including from your own network, who have covered multiple previous Israeli assaults on the Gaza Strip, say they have never experienced anything of this intensity and have concluded that Israel is using new forms of bombs or missiles, presumably ground-penetrating missiles, the effects of which they have never experienced before. Now, Israel is not just launching a military assault on the Gaza Strip. It has hermetically sealed off the Gaza Strip, and most importantly, it has now imposed a total medieval siege of the Gaza Strip. It has cut off electricity, it has cut off the water supply, it has cut off, it has demolished towers that give people access to internet and telecommunications. So, this is very reminiscent of the Israeli siege of West Beirut in 1982, with one crucial difference. The Palestinian and Lebanese residents and defenders of Beirut in 1982 had bomb shelters. In the Gaza Strip, there are no bomb shelters, or at least very few. And Israel, which of course occupied this territory in 1967, had a policy that it was illegal to build bomb shelters.
If I can ask you, please, Mouin, about if we could go back to what happened on the weekend.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about the level of sophistication and invasiveness of Israel's surveillance of Gaza. Just how the methods that are used there, the assumption that everything that happens in Gaza is known by the Israeli intelligence. And despite that, Hamas managed to plan such a kind of extensive operation. Just help us make sense of that and how that kind of deception occurred.
Well, the Gaza Strip is the most intensely surveyed territory on Earth. It's not only very small, it's not only very densely populated, but it's under full comprehensive Israeli surveillance, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, through multiple means. There's, of course, electronic, all electronic communications are monitored around the clock by Israel. You can't make a phone call or send a text message or an email or a WhatsApp or a Facebook post without Israel immediately receiving a copy of that before the website for which it is intended. Secondly, one cannot enter, or rather one cannot exit the Gaza Strip, for example, to seek urgent medical care for a child who has cancer in an Israeli hospital or in the West Bank, or to get a work permit to work in Israel, for example, without going through the Israeli permit regime. And what that means is that Israel has access to all these human sources and is able to put pressure on them to collaborate with the Israeli forces or Israeli intelligence in exchange for these essential services that people need. Another factor is that drones are in the air over the Gaza Strip 24 hours a day. So Israel has not only ears, but also eyes over every speck of dust in the Gaza Strip. This raises a question of how Hamas and Islamic Jihad were able to successfully plan and execute this Operation Al-Aqsa Deluge. And I would say there's a technical aspect, but also a political aspect. The technical aspect, and I'm really speculating because this is not an area I'm at all familiar with, but they presumably went out of their way to avoid any electronic or digital communications and reverted to old-fashioned pen and paper, if you will. And it's clear that an operation of this size would have required very substantial communications, between leaders, commanders, cadres, fighters, and so on. So a second factor would have been a very high level of compartmentalization, so that if someone was caught, their knowledge about the overall plan would have been very limited, and they wouldn't have been in a position to provide Israel substantial information about it. And so these are the kind of technical issues. A third one is that let's not overestimate the sophistication of what happened, in the sense that Gaza is a blockaded area, and many of the materials and weapons used are of a very rudimentary nature. I mean, we're talking about paragliders, that were used, for example, to drop hand grenades into the electronic sensors on the barriers that surround the Gaza Strip, to disable the electronic machine guns that begin firing as soon as one of the sensors is set off, because that supposedly alerts to an infiltration and things of, there's a very sophisticated, I think, billion-dollar electronic barrier surrounding the entirety of the boundary between the Gaza Strip and Israel. But secondly, there's also the political aspect. And that relates to Israeli complacency, Israeli hubris, an inability to believe that these inferior beings who have been so thoroughly denigrated and dehumanized by Israel would be capable of challenging them in any significant respect. And that is, I think, a second parallel with the 1973 October War that bears referring to, because in 1973, the Israelis simply refused to believe that Arab armies were capable of fighting, let alone fighting successfully, that they would ever dare to launch a military offensive against the Israeli military. And what you had then was that Israel did have substantial warnings of what was about to happen, but refused to believe them. Here, I think it's even worse in that they appear not to have even had basic information of what was about to hit them.
When we talk about Hamas's media strategy, which appears to have been as carefully calibrated as the attack itself, what did they show? What was the message that was intended to be delivered? How effectively did Hamas kind of follow that up in the days after the operation?
Well, yes, I think Hamas's media strategy was very reminiscent of the media strategy that Hezbollah in Lebanon used to use during the 1990s. And by this I mean that the pattern in southern Lebanon used to be that Hezbollah would carry out a successful attack on either the Israeli occupation military there or against its South Lebanon army collaborators, and Israel would deny it. You know, and everyone say, "Oh, here they are, bragging again," without ever achieving anything. And Hezbollah then began documenting in real time its attacks, and therefore Israel was no longer in a position to deny what was taking place. And in fact, this is how Hezbollah at certain points achieved greater credibility with the Israeli public than the Israeli military, which was still stuck in the old routine of propaganda of denying any success that had been achieved against it. And what I think we've seen on October 7th was that Hamas and Islamic Jihad were mainly concerned with documenting their operational success, if I can use that term, in order to demonstrate that they were indeed able to achieve what they claimed to have been able to achieve. Having said that, I don't think that really is a comprehensive media strategy. It is meant to, I think, impress primarily Israelis and Palestinians of this is what we've done, this is what we're capable of. But I wouldn't characterize it as a, let's say, comprehensive or particularly sophisticated military strategy in the sense that it was one that was tied to achieving certain political objectives or promoting a certain political agenda or anything of that sort.
Just briefly, very briefly, Mouin, could you just tell us a little bit about what we saw in those videos over the course of those few days? You mentioned the paragliders, but aside from that, what did we see in there?
Well, to give one example, there was the Israeli naval base at Zikim, which is just north of the Gaza Strip. And initially, Israel denied that Hamas's claims that it had managed to launch a successful attack on that base from the sea, because the operation came from land, air, and sea. Israel denied that this attack had ever taken place. And then videos emerged showing the speedboats or launchers arriving, landing on the beach outside Zikim, the soldiers going in, and then the Hamas fighters going in. And then we see the dead bodies of a number of Israeli soldiers, and showing the Hamas fighters basically sauntering around the Zikim military base. Another one is the Erez checkpoint, which is the crossing the Israeli boundary crossing that controls access to and from the Gaza Strip, and it showed, so I should add a symbol that's particularly hated among Palestinians, and it showed Hamas or Palestinian fighters, I'm not sure if they were Hamas or Islamic Jihad, parading around it, taking files which are said to include the names of Palestinian collaborators, which may or may not be the case, taking equipment such as computers and so on, and basically dismantling this central feature of Israeli control of Palestinian movement.
Thank you very much. Thank you. After the initial shock, Israel obviously swung into battle mode, not least on the messaging front. Can you talk us through what you found notable, the official rhetoric, the use of phrases like Israel of 9/11, human animals as governments were described? What have you found notable about the manner?
Two aspects, because I think Israel's media strategy has been, if not more sophisticated, it's been much more, Israel has implemented its media strategy with a much more political objective in mind, and that political objective has been primarily to generate international sympathy and support for Israel, and I think that's a key distinction. Whereas Hamas aimed its media campaign primarily at Israeli and Palestinian public opinion, my sense is that Israel's strategy has been primarily aimed at the outside world, or at least this aspect of it. And the purpose there was to characterize the Palestinian fighters who launched these attacks into Israel as basically barbarians, terrorists, whose only agenda was to kill, rape, murder, take hostage as many civilians as possible, and in so doing, minimize to the greatest possible extent any military dimension to this. And it's been successful. I mean, if you were to read the lead editorial in the New York Times, it was published this past Tuesday. This is a time for unity and resolve, and it refers to the entire operation of 7th of October as an attack on Israel's civilian, a terrorist attack on Israel's civilian population. And the idea that this was in any way a military or a primarily military operation whose primary targets or objectives were military simply disappears from view. And so that's why you get these kind of statements like Israel's 9/11, even people comparing this in one way or another to the Holocaust. What was one reporter or analyst was talking about the largest number of Jewish dead in one day since the Holocaust. In other words, that this is, this should be seen as part of the same narrative as the Nazi exterminations of World War II. And so I think that's the first element. These are beasts, these are terrorists whose only agenda, and an agenda driven by pure hatred, is simply to attack, murder Israeli civilians, and preferably we would like you to think of them as Jews rather than Israelis, because of course that resonates much better historically. And then you began to see, for example, videos of beheadings that were culled from the conflict in Syria and presented as having taken place in the Gaza periphery. There was this rave party in the desert just outside the Gaza Strip, where there appears to have been large-scale civilian casualties, and everyone wants, the focus to be on the attack on this rave party, which I think is a perfectly legitimate question to ask. And to the extent, that there were violations of the laws of war and of the sanctity of civilian life and so on. That is perfectly legitimate. But isn't it also appropriate to question the wisdom of those who decided to organize a rave in the desert just outside a concentration camp? The second aspect of Israel's media strategy, having established that this was an attack by people who essentially have no legitimate grievance against Israel and were driven purely by hatred and bloodlust and a desire to kill and murder and rape and behead and whatnot, well, then you begin to dehumanize them. Then they become human animals. Then you begin to be able to say, we're cutting off the water, we're cutting off the electricity, we're preventing the entry of any foods or medicine, and if we had the capacity, we would also shut off the oxygen. And then you get not a single Western politician making even a peep of concern about this.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. The Israeli government and Netanyahu specifically, they were already under intense public pressure before the last few days. Mm-hmm. In this context, how bad a crisis is this for them? And how is Netanyahu seeking to limit the damage to his own reputation via the viciousness of the response and his own rhetoric?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between the short-term consequences and the longer-term consequences. And the short-term consequences, and we also saw this in Israel in previous instances after the 1973 war and so on. In the short term, particularly while a conflict is ongoing, the general pattern is that people rally around their leadership, even if against their better judgment. And during the past week, there have been intensive discussions going on within the Israeli political leadership to form a broader coalition government, and so on. And so I think, and I should also add the whole protest movement against Netanyahu's judicial legislative program. That's now off the agenda as well. People are talking about Hamas and not about Netanyahu seeking to transform the prime ministry into an autocracy and so on. And so I think in the short term, he can rest easy, particularly if he succeeds in forming a broader coalition government, which is also something that he's being strongly encouraged to do by his chief allies in the United States and Europe. Over the longer term, of course, it's a very different story, because when the dust settles and people begin asking themselves, how did we, this happened on your watch. What were you thinking? Why were we so unprepared? Why were they able to do all this right under your nose without any questions were being asked? And why did you refuse to meet with your defense minister when he wanted to inform you of the damage that the judicial legislation would do to Israel's security establishment? And then questions will begin to be asked. I mean, I could think of, a good historical example, which is Moshe Dayan, Israel's defense minister at the time of the 1973 war. In 1971, he, very arrogantly stated, if I have to choose between peace without Sharm el-Sheikh or Sharm el-Sheikh without peace, I choose for Sharm el-Sheikh without peace. 2 years later, you had the 1973 war. He had to resign as a result of his incompetence in that event. And several years later, he was a chief negotiator with Egypt for returning Sharm el-Sheikh to Egyptian sovereignty. Will we see something similar happening as a result of Operation Al-Aqsa Deluge and all that has surrounded it? I wouldn't make any confident predictions about that. I think it's much too early to speculate. But I will also point out that another effect of the 1973 war was to begin to very significantly empower Israel's messianic settler movement, movements like Gush Emunim and so on, who began to fear that there might be a serious international campaign to force a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict along the lines of UN resolutions 242 and 338, and began to much more intensively pursue the settlement and colonization of the occupied Palestinian and Syrian, and at the time also Egyptian territory. So, you know, it does work in various ways. If I could just make one more point, the American analyst Jeffrey Aronson recently wrote an article which I thought quite perceptively pointed out that what you have now is an Israeli government, some of whose key figures, such as Itamar Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, are actually not only are they not did they not emerge from the security establishment, which has been the traditional midwife of Israel's political leadership. Not only did they not emerge from that, but they in effect built their political careers in opposition to this establishment because they view it as pro-Palestinian, an agent of Hamas or whatnot, and they view it as insufficiently Zionist. Now, could one of the effects of this conflict be either to weaken them to the extent that they're sent back to the asylum in a straitjacket, or contrary to that, will this be their opportunity to finally seize supreme political power over Israel? And if you look at how the Israeli voting public has behaved in recent elections, I certainly wouldn't exclude either of those scenarios.
Thank you. There's a few more things that I really do want to get to.
Sure.
Let me go first just to the normalization negotiations and agreements. There's been a lot of regional political shifting happening vis-a-vis Israel and Palestine. This process of normalization, which Netanyahu was really pursuing to create security agreements across the region, economic agreements that would make the Palestinian cause an irrelevance. How do you see all of that now, that process, and you know, where does those normalization agreements
Yes.
go from here?
You know, I've read quite a few articles that one of the main objectives of Operation Al-Aqsa Deluge was to sabotage the prospects of a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement. I simply don't buy it. Oh, and an additional factor, of course, being not only to sabotage it, but sabotaging it by acting on behalf of Iran's interests in doing so. Anyway, you can edit that part out. So, I would just like to say I find it very difficult to take that analysis seriously. The reason being that I don't take the prospect of a Saudi-Israeli normalization agreement anytime soon seriously. And there are a number of reasons, but I'll just mention one to keep this brief, and that is that what we are really talking about is a Saudi-Israeli-American agreement, which in order to be consummated would require the United States Congress to extend certain guarantees and privileges to Saudi Arabia that are simply not on the cards, number one. And second of all, would require a number of Israeli gestures towards the Palestinians that, despite being only purely cosmetic in nature, would never get through the Israeli government, because Netanyahu effectively has to choose between an agreement, has to either effectively choose between a different coalition agreement, in which case he has to choose between that or going to prison. And therefore, he's going to hang on to his current coalition. Having said that, I do think that embarrassing those Arab governments that have normalized relations with Israel or have maintained formal or informal relations with Israel is, I think, from the view of those who planned and launched this operation, an added benefit. And I think if you look at it that way, then yes, what we are seeing now would be much more significant in a country like Saudi Arabia, which has a much larger and politically more engaged population and so on, than perhaps a place like Sharjah. But I don't think this was a main purpose. I do think it has those added benefits.
Has the reaction, Marlene, from Western capitals been a surprise to you in any way? How is it that Western governments remain so unevolved in their position on Israel and Palestine?
The Western response to these events has not surprised me in the least. There has been no criticism whatsoever of Israel. All condemnation is reserved exclusively for the Palestinians. Israel is being extended unconditional and uncritical support. Not only that, Western governments are doing this in the full knowledge of how Israel will interpret their support, which is using it as a license to kill, as a license to starve, as a license to massacre. And the reason I'm not surprised is if you go back to the beginning of the Palestinian Nakba in 1948 until today, you literally will not find a single instance where an Israeli policy or practice against the Palestinian people has led to a significant, sustained reduction in Western support for Israel. To the contrary, the 1948 Nakba was celebrated for enabling the establishment of Israel. 1967 occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip was celebrated as a divine miracle. The 1982 invasion of Lebanon and Sabra Shatila massacres mainly awed the West with its displays of Israel's agonizing soul searching and so on. I could go on, but I think the broader point is clear. There is simply nothing Israel has done, is doing, or will ever do that will reduce or interrupt Western support for Israel. And in fact, if we look at the past few decades, the more brutal, the more violent, the more crazy, if you will, Israel has gotten in its policies towards the Palestinians, the greater the West's support for Israel has become. And I think we should dispense this illusion that is ever going to change. And I think this also has political consequences for those Palestinian and other politicians who still believe that salvation is in any way to be found with the West. We need to understand, as Palestinians, the West is not our ally. It is our enemy because it is a chief ally of our oppressors, has been, is, always will be. Secondly, if you look at how this is being portrayed, any Palestinian who uses violence is by definition a terrorist. If he is shooting at an armed Israeli soldier in uniform at combat duty, the Palestinian attacking him is still a terrorist. An Israeli pilot using an F-16 to drop one-ton bombs on civilian homes in the most densely populated territory on earth is exercising his right of self-defense. The Palestinian right of self-defense is non-existent. Israel can do whatever it wants. Its policies will always be justified. And I think it's also important, to take a step back from the hypocrisy that we have become so accustomed to, and to recognize that human suffering and mass civilian suffering is actually a traditional policy instrument of Israel and Western governments. I mean, I'm now speaking to you from the Armenian capital, Yerevan, where only last month the Azerbaijani state overran the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh, and within the space of less than a week, 120,000 people, ethnic Armenians who had been living there since time immemorial, simply vanished. We didn't hear a word of Western protest, not a word, and nor will you. And that's why I have zero confidence that we will see any significant policy response, perhaps with the exception of the Republic of Ireland, to what is happening now in Palestine.
Thank you. And a question then on the media coverage. I'm sure you would have seen some of the international journalists who have swarmed on places like Ashkelon and other Israeli communities near the border. They have a proximity to the story that produces depth and empathy in their reporting.
Yes.
The names of those who've been killed, their stories, the names of the hostages. How stark a contrast is that with the coverage of the Palestinian side?
Well, this is nothing new. Israeli victims of the violence of this conflict, whether they're soldiers or civilians, they have names, they have faces, they have parents, spouses, children, communities, schools, and so on. They are multidimensional human beings that we feel for. Palestinians are nameless, faceless, irrelevant human scum. And I should add, when the Israeli defense minister recently referred to Palestinians as human animals, he wasn't only reflecting the sentiments of the Israeli leadership and political elites. More importantly, I think the record shows he was quite clearly that he can also legitimately claim to have been speaking on behalf of the vast majority of Western governing elites. And, look, I think what's important to understand is that for the Western media, this is a story about Israel. Israel is the center of the story. This is not about Israel and Palestine. Palestine is an appendage to the center of this story, the core of this story, which is Israel. So, for example, forget Fox News and radical media. Let's not even talk about mainstream US media like the New York Times. Let's talk about the British Guardian newspaper, which is seen, I think, by most people as a perfectly acceptable progressive newspaper. The past week, I think, on the second or the third day of the crisis, when Palestinians were already being killed by the bushel, you open their website and look at their homepage, 2 headlines mention the number of total Israeli casualties. There's not even an attempt to project that there may also be large numbers of dead in the Gaza Strip. On Tuesday, there's a headline, Tuesday, after exceptionally 24 hours of exceptionally violent, I would argue unprecedented bombing of the Gaza Strip, the headline in The Guardian, fears grow for hostages, meaning the Israeli hostages, in the Gaza Strip. In other words, the Palestinians are a subhuman appendage to the story that really matters, which is Israel.
And just related to that, Mouin, has Hamas's violent actions, its killings of civilians, its hostages, old and young, given an opening to Western governments and the media on how to frame this moment?
Of course it has. Of course it has. And again, no taking of innocent human life can ever be justified under any circumstances. Having said that, the point I would also make is that if Hamas had stood on the borders of Gaza and simply thrown paper airplanes into Israel, the condemnation would be no less fierce. And again, context is completely missing. Yes, there was a Palestinian offensive into Israel, but there's been a 17-year blockade. There's been mass murder in the Gaza Strip by Israel. There's been over half a century of occupation. There's been almost a century of uprooting and dispossession. The reason the Gaza Strip is the most densely populated area on earth is because these are all refugees from what is now Israel. Yet somehow this totality of Palestinian suffering is irrelevant and doesn't matter, because all we really care about is what these monsters, these barbarians do to the people we do care about, who are the Israelis, most of whom look like us. That's the real story here.
I'm almost done. I mean, one question just for me, Raheem. How do you see this for those who would wish to defend the principle of armed resistance to occupation, and with the knowledge of what we've witnessed in Ukraine? How difficult a moment is it to kind of to articulate that right to resist?
I'm sorry, just so I understand your question, are you saying how can people who support Ukraine resisting Russia not support Palestinians?
I'm sorry, yeah, I'm kind of riffing here. So what I mean is, we've been talking a lot, reporting a lot, about the double standards when it comes to the right to resist, and how that right is celebrated in Ukraine and is obviously not done so, not in any way even recognized in the case of Palestinians. I guess my question is, in light of what's happened in the last few days, in light of Hamas's operation, how much more complicated is it, or how important is it right now to articulate
Not,
Palestinian right to resist?
well, not at all. I mean, never underestimate the power of cognitive dissonance. I mean, look at Joe Biden. Look at Vladimir Zelensky. He's come out so powerfully in support of Israel and claimed this is all a Russian plot to undermine Western democracy. So never underestimate the power of cognitive dissonance. I'll give you a small historical anecdote, if I may. During the first Intifada, I worked for a Palestinian human rights organization in the West Bank named Al-Haq. And we would periodically meet with members of the Foreign Diplomatic Corps, update them, about Israel's growing brutality and so on, and new policies and practices. And whenever we would meet with a representative of the American consulate in East Jerusalem, and we would start talking about the Fourth Geneva Conventions, we get a wave of the hand of, okay, yeah, you've said it, I've heard it, let's move on to the next subject. Then, shortly after I left the organization, Iraq invaded and occupied Kuwait in 1990. And then a few weeks later, I was reading a newspaper, and there was a report. I can't recall if it was from the U.S. State Department, but it was certainly an official American agency. I felt like they'd plagiarized us. They were making exactly the same arguments with full conviction that they had so cavalierly dismissed when they were made about their allies. So I don't think these people see any contradiction between opposing occupation in one context and supporting it in another. Not at all. And there's one other point I wanted to make about this, but it escapes me. Maybe it'll. No, another point I would make, and this is in response to your last two questions. When people do claim to be opposing occupation or aggression or murder of civilians or any other violation, and they claim that they are standing up for principle, then they have to demonstrate that they apply those principles equally and across the board. And I reserve the right, where they do not do so, to dismiss their condemnation and I reserve the right, where they do not apply those principles equally, to dismiss their condemnation with utter contempt and not even to take it seriously. You know, anyone who comes to me now and condemns Palestinians for any violation they've committed against Israeli civilians, but then refuses to condemn Israeli violations against Palestinian civilians, either on the pretext that this is a right of self-defense or that, you know, I'm not allowed to do this because I'm German or whatever, I can't take them seriously because they are not defending a principle, they are defending a state.
Okay, final question then. Where do we go from here? Do you get any sense that the bloodshed of the last few days will lead to a reckoning or a deeper conversation on apartheid, Palestine, and the besiegement of Gaza, or will it do the opposite?
I think it's very early. I think it's very early to reach any conclusions about where this is going to lead. First of all, we still don't know how this is going to play out. You know, is the Gaza Strip going to be made unfit for human habitation? Will it develop into a wider conflict, perhaps? There are so many questions about what we are currently observing that I think we still need to see. But I will say, in the longer term, I think there is one important result of what we've been experiencing the past week, and that is that Israel and the United States and Europe, that alliance, axis of evil, whatever you want to call it, had reached the conclusion that they could safely ignore the Palestinians and that we would simply disappear. They could go on with business as usual. You know, they could have their little Abrahams. They could expend all their diplomatic efforts on trying to forge an agreement with Saudi Arabia and Israel. They could, as they have done now so powerfully, normalize Ben Gvir, normalize Smotrich, turn Netanyahu into a saint, and they could simply ignore us because, you know, we were encaged in the Gaza Strip, or we were being devoured by the settlers in the West Bank, or we were rotting away in refugee camps in Lebanon. And the idea that, you know, these people are simply going to turn into politically irrelevant human dust. I think that now needs to be reconsidered, though I very much doubt it will.